lectures. And today's lecture by Dr. Batra is extending this discourse and giving it an interesting cultural turn. Her lecture is titled Theatre and Right to Food Staples in India. Curiously, the last lecture by Professor Jaydeep Ghosh closed with a discussion on right to food staples and nutrition and such issues. So Kanika would be continuing the conversation, which is very interesting because we see this series as a continuum, not just as individual lectures, because that is not the way we would want to take this forward. So we are very happy that we have Kanika Batra with us, and we have Purvi Pawar, who is in chairing this lecture and moderating the discussion. I'll introduce Purvi now. Purvi Pawar is an editor, translator and critic. She was associate professor at the College of Vocational Studies, University of Delhi. Her work includes studies on Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Forster and B.S. Naipaul, with special reference to their representation of India. Her areas of special interest are colonial and post-colonial fiction and travel writing. Over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Rizio. I take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Kanika Batra, who's Associate Professor at the Department of English, Texas Tech University. She specializes in post-colonial literatures and teaches, researches post-colonial feminism and post-colonial queer studies. Her articles have appeared in journals such as Kalabalu, Feminist Review, the Journal of Commonwealth and Post-Colonial Studies, Intentions, International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies. In 2001, she published a monograph on Caribbean poetry for the Indira Gandhi National Open University, India. Her second book, Feminist Visions and Queer Futures in Post-Colonial Drama, was published by Routledge in 2011. She is currently working on a new book project tentatively titled Post-Colonial Counterpublics, Gender and Sexualities in print, scheduled to appear in 2015. Now I hand over the mic to Dr. Batra.
Thanks, Rizio and Purabi, for those very generous introductions, and thank you all for being here. It gets dark pretty early now, so I know you all made a special effort to be here, particularly the students. So I hope it's worth your while to have made the trip from different parts of Delhi to listen to this lecture. I find that mics often distract me, so I'm going to push it to the side, and if the audio quality is bad, just let me know. Oh, okay. Okay. I'll try and ignore the mic as much as I can. My paper today is titled "The Right to Food Staples in India," and there is a subtitle to it, which I did not include in the flyer, which is "Dramatizing a Cultural History of Shame and Pride." And I say this at a particularly, dramatic moment in Indian political and social scenarios, because we all know that the Food Security Bill was announced on August 26th, right? And we all know that there was a lot of debate generated around that. Some have even blamed the fall of the rupee on that announcement. I do not think that is the case, but there are people who think that the Food Security Bill is not a good thing for the country. And my talk today is talking about certain cultural representations of food in Indian literature, particularly in Indian drama. And I'm towards the end of the paper, I try to connect it to the Food Security Bill and try to show why it is important for us to continue thinking about these things today, much as Indian authors have been thinking about them for a long, long, long time. Dramatic representations open a discussion on the social implications of food production and distribution in India by presenting dichotomies of the colonial and the post-colonial, the rural and the urban, the moral and the political, and deprivation and hoarding. And I think you can see all the connections here, even in the food security bill. The availability or scarcity of wheat in these representations point to ubiquitous divisions within Indian society, continuing from the early to the late 20th century. These divisions stem from class and caste equalities, but also indicate enormous social and cultural costs of obtaining food. Premchand wrote, we all are familiar with the great Hindi writer Munshi Premchand, and if you are not, then I suggest you go back and read his stories, because everybody should be aware of the important representations present in Premchand's work. Premchand wrote Sawa Se Gehu, or a handful of wheat, in the 1920s, at a time when colonial rule in India had introduced large-scale changes in modes of food cultivation and distribution in the country. The story has been performed as a play by amateur and professional theatre groups since its publication. This is a story which is repeatedly performed for the stage, again and again, every few years, several times a year. People are going back to many of Premchand's narratives and using them as markers for whatever situation is currently being explored. So he wrote a handful of wheat in the 1920s at a time when colonial rule in India had introduced large-scale changes in modes of food cultivation and distribution in the country. The story has been performed as a play by amateur and professional theatre groups since its publication, though these productions are hard to document in the light of scarce performance records. But if you Google and type in the keywords Premchand, dramatic representations, you will find thousands and thousands of links to short clippings of dramatizations of Premchand's stories. In 2004, the story was dramatized on television with a screenplay by Gulzar in the low-budget theatrical format preferred by Doordarshan. The adaptation was part of Prasar Bharati's Indian Classics series for young audiences, a stand reiterated by Gulzar when he called for translation of literary works into new media. This is all available on YouTube, courtesy some avid viewers who feel that Premchand's the televisation of Premchand's stories deserve to be available in free and open access manner for everybody. Premchand's tale begins a discussion of staple food and exploitation that continues into post-colonial times. These are just some screenshots from the beginning of the Doordarshan adaptation. Change of slide. Yeah, and these are further screenshots. The street theatre group Jan Natya Manch continues this tradition of social critique by dramatizing food hoarding in India through the play Samarth Ko Nahi Dosh Gosai, or The Powerful Cannot Be Blamed, performed in the 1980s. Next slide. My aim in this paper is to discuss the dramatization of cycles of food scarcity, abundance, and then scarcity again, especially wheat, through adaptations of Premchand's story and Janam's street performances. Some of you may be familiar with Jan Natya Manch's performances. Jan Natya Manch has been performing since the 1970s, and what they do is, in a very sort of minimalist manner, without extensive use of props or costumes, they go around performing plays on issues of contemporary relevance. So, for instance, the DTC price rise in bus fares, or in support of the college teachers, the Delhi University Teachers Association, or, for instance, violence against women. In this case, the play I am discussing from the 1980s was talking about food hoarding in India, specifically in the public distribution system, which was which was introduced a long time ago, but which we all know has some serious pitfalls. My aim is to discuss the dramatization of cycles of food scarcity, abundance and scarcity, specifically wheat, through adaptations of Premchand's story and Janam's street performances, as markers of national pride and shame. With discussions of food security taking center stage in recent years, Premchand's story has assumed renewed importance, and recent dramatizations include those by Rang Yatra, the Uttar Pradesh Drama Academy, and a musical version by Lok Samiti Kala Manch in Varanasi, both in 2001, and a children's performance organized by Kiran, an NGO serving children with disabilities, in 2010. The Mumbai-based Idea Entertainment Group presented a festival of Premchand stories adapted to the stage, including Sawa Ser Gehu at Ranchi University in 2010. Now, revivals of Janam's plays, particularly the one that I am discussing, have been less frequent, but the Patna Art and Craft College's students produced Samarth Ko Nahi Dosh Ko Sai in street theatre format at the 2010 Patna Book Fair. In Premchand's celebrated oeuvre of short stories and fiction, described as nationalist and social realist, wheat functions as a shifting symbol of the exploited, poverty-ridden lives of simple, honest, hard-working farmers in colonial India. I'm going on now to discuss very briefly what exactly Premchand's story is about and what exactly Janam's play is about, to give you a sense of how these authors and the dramatists are representing food in their literature. In the immediate aftermath of colonial rule, the newly independent country found it hard to feed its people and was forced to rely on wheat imports. People of my parents' generation remember this time very well. I have no memory of it. I was not even born at that time. And neither were many of you sitting here in the audience. This is the period 1950s and 1960s, right? So the period between the publication of Premchand's story in the 1920s and Janam's performance in the 1980s saw shameful imports of wheat under PL 480. Now PL 480, for those of you who do not know this, was a US food aid program, right? And it was understood by the Indians living in the 1950s and 1960s as sending us the wheat those Americans fed to their pigs. It was low quality wheat. It was a kind of a donation made by the US government to India. It was imposed, when the donation was made, conditionalities were imposed on the aid. And it was really a matter of shame for the country to be forced to rely on another country for food. India is a primarily agricultural country. If it is being forced to rely on another country for food, really it is no matter of pride for that country, right? After a discussion of Premchand's story and its visual representations, I briefly examined the history of US food aid to India in the 1960s, followed by the monumental increase in wheat production in the country, owing to the use of hybrid varieties and chemical fertilizers that in part led to the phenomena we now know as the Green Revolution. And this is a very sort of significant moment in Indian history, because this is a moment of pride, right? Nobody wants to remember the PL 480 period. People want to remember the Green Revolution, right? Because we did a lot in those times. We attained self-sufficiency in food. So let's all remember that moment. Let's not remember the period immediately before that when we were begging other countries for food. This account, I think, is useful in an examination of Janam's play, Samarth Ko Nahi Dosh Ko Sai, to indicate that the abundance of food that was the promise of the Green Revolution did not make its way to all, right? Street theatre highlights some of these contradictions, whereby wheat deprivation and its excess are both untenable as fixed markers of national shame and pride respectively, particularly since the benefits of food abundance are unavailable to the masses at large. This is the case even today. We all know that there's enough food produced in India to feed the population 2 times over, but that it is not available to everybody. There are leakages in the system, there is corruption in the system. There are malpractices in the distribution, there's hoarding, right, which is and should be a matter of national shame, right? I end this talk with a very brief account of the recent controversies around the Food Security Bill, a problematization of an over-reliance on cereals such as wheat and rice to fulfill the calorific needs of the population, as well as the endemic nature of hunger and starvation in India, in Harsh Mandar's passionately written account, which came out just a few months ago, called Ash in the Belly, India's Unfinished Battle Against Hunger. And another must read for all of you young people in the audiences. You know, it certainly opened my eyes to some of the systemic endemic problems. And you know, I highly recommend it if you haven't had a chance to look at it already. Very depressing, but very useful to get a realistic perspective on what is actually the situation here in India. Mindful of the burgeoning of food studies from various disciplines, I want to emphasize I am not a food studies scholar. You know, this is a relatively new area for me. I am a teacher of literature and theory, although my work has always been interdisciplinary. Right? And that this talk that I'm giving today arises out of my contact with food scarcity in primarily urban locations. I have grown up in Delhi, I have lived in cities all my life, and I have seen urban poverty and hunger. I have no experience of rural poverty and hunger. Right? The food scarcity I have seen has been in Delhi, Kathmandu, Chicago, Johannesburg, Kingston, and my current city, Lubbock, which I'm sure very few of you are familiar with. It is in the northwestern part of Texas. It is a city of 250,000 people, so very small compared to these other locations. And here in Lubbock, where I currently live, homeless and often hungry people sit on the steps of the downtown public library waiting for food handouts. Additionally, Amartya Sen and Jean Grace's important work on famines and food entitlements in India, and Ursa Patnaik and Jayati Ghosh, and many of you were here for Jayati's presentation last week, their analysis of food and development has been central to my thinking. And theatre is the way I have organized my thoughts for so long that it has almost become a habit for me to bring it into whatever is currently occupying my mind. Right? So with this caveat, I move on to Premchand, whose narratives are so rich in dialogue that very little work is needed in adapting them to dramatic purposes. One of the biggest economic changes described in Premchand's narrative is the introduction of colonial taxes and levies on landowners who control landholdings, employing peasants as labor. In part, this led to the change in the landowner-peasant relationship, which was always imagined, though of course this was not really the case. It was imagined as a moral exchange of benevolence and patronage. You know, this is the way the caste system is organized, right? The upper castes are benevolent and the lower castes receive the patronage. Never mind the exploitation, never mind the poverty, right? And it was restructured under colonialism. This is one opinion. This relationship of landowner and peasant, which is imagined as one of benevolence and patronage, is restructured under colonialism as a commercial transaction between a tenant and a landlord. So blame everything on colonialism and say, you know, previously Indian society was one happy structure of caste hierarchies where the landowner was very benevolent towards the peasant. But colonialism changed everything. And then now, landowners became very commercial minded because, you know, they had to pay taxes to the British, right? Since Sawa Ser Gehu, Premchand's story that I am discussing, is about a farmer who owns his land, it does not describe the landowner-peasant relationship, but rather one between a money-lending priest and the landed but poor farmer. It begins with the arrival of a holy man at a farmer named Shankar's house. This is just a brief outline of the story. While Shankar and his wife eat coarse grain, jwar, they eat roti made out of jwar. They do not think it is respectful to serve such subsistence fare to the holy man. To serve the man of God as befits his elevated status, Shankar borrows a handful of wheat, sawa ser gehu, from the village priest and asks his wife to make rotis from the borrowed grain. The loan of wheat follows Shankar through a lifetime, for while he believes he has more than repaid it by offering the priest extra grain during his yearly collections, the priest takes the extra as his due and not as repayment of the loan. After a period of many years, he reminds Shankar that the sum of 60 rupees is owed to him in lieu of the grain. Remember, this is the 1920s, right? So 60 rupees is a big sum of money at that point of time. He reminds Shankar that this sum is owed to him in lieu of the grain and the accumulated interest on that debt. Premchand's tale is therefore not only an expose of the gastropolitics, this is not my term, I'll explain whose term it is a while later. It is an exposure of the gastropolitics of food and social hierarchies, but also of the economic impact of such a politics over generations. In the televised version of the story, which appeared in 2004, the intricate connections between consumption and distribution of food and religion are brought out vividly. If you go back, Hamid, to the slides on Premchand. Yeah, right there. Yeah. Shankar and his brother are, no, the next one please. Shankar and his brother are shown working in the fields. These are screenshots from the televised version. You can see they are threshing the wheat, right? They interrupt their labors to eat a sparse meal prepared by their wives, thank God for their food and resume work. They never stopped working, right? Shankar's interaction with the holy man and the village priest are respectful to the extreme, as befits a man of his morals. You can see he's pressing the holy man's feet. He's serving him, right? As befits his dharma, right? His generosity to the villagers in distributing part of his wheat harvest is what causes a rift with his brother. And when he later goes to ask the priest to excuse his loan, bushels of wheat form the backdrop to the interaction. I've not included that, but that is very clear in the televised version. In the foreground are pictures of various gods and goddesses in the priest's house, and that you can see. The most prominent being that of Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess of wealth. So, he really worships the gods and goddesses, but the goddess he worships the most, the biggest image is that of Lakshmi, right? A focus on food and religion in the televised version is thus in keeping with similar visual representations in recent dramatizations, right? A 2010 production by Apna Ghar, an organization which works with street children, uses the street theatre format to enact the narrative and points to the connection between the holy man and the money-lending priest through the saffron-colored clothing worn by both. Right? I have not included that, but if you Google it, you will find it. The roti that Shankar's wife prepares for the holy man with grain borrowed from the money-lending priest serves to further seal this connection between food and religion. Right? Shankar grows grain, he grows wheat, but he cannot afford it for himself. The details of the meal prepared for the holy man are not as important as the fact that the staple food grain in India, wheat, is not to be found either in Shankar or in any one of his neighbors' house. He goes around begging for wheat from his neighbors, but nobody has wheat. Everybody eats jowar. However, it is unlikely that the holy man was served only roti for his meal, particularly since he is described in the story as somebody who looks like he has been worshipping at the feasts of the rich, traveling to places of pilgrimage on airborne chariots, and acquiring divine wisdom by eating food that was to his liking. Now, Premchand in Hindi is very resonant. You can imagine if he is describing the holy man as eating food fit for the gods, be sure that it is ironical and not meant to be a sort of a realistic portrayal of what is happening. While Shankar and his family subsist on a pittance, the man of God cannot be expected to do so. With more than a hint of irony, Premchand writes that after eating a bellyful, the holy man slept contently. In the televised version, the holy man asks for bread with milk, somewhat changing the semiotics of a rural North Indian meal comprising usually, but not always, a vegetable dish, that is sabji, dal and achar, that usually accompanies wheat roti. If somebody is eating well, then they will eat sabji, dal with the roti, right? Not everybody eats well, we know that. Now, we can analyze food from various perspectives. I find that a semiotic analysis of food is very important. If you try to arrive at the caste, class and religious hierarchies operating through the medium of food, then you really need a semiotic analysis of food. And some of you may have heard of Arjun Appadurai. Who has heard of Arjun Appadurai? pretty much everybody, right? We know him as a theorist of globalization, right? The mediascape, the technoscape, and the ideascape. Well, he wrote that in 1997, pretty late in his career. Appadurai, many of you may or may not know, is first and foremost an anthropologist, right? I became familiar with his work in the late 80s. I started reading his work on gender, caste, and class hierarchies, which he was developing through an analysis of Indian folklore, right? And he used A.K. Ramanujan, the eminent folklorist. He used some of his narratives. Appadurai used some of Ramanujan's narratives to arrive at an analysis of caste, class, and gender in Indian society. So before his current avatar as the foremost theorist of globalization, he was looking at food and social customs and religion in India from a cultural anthropological perspective. And Appadurai, he's the one who invented the term gastropolitics, not me. I'm not so smart, so Appadurai is. So he says, what is gastropolitics? He says we need to ask a few questions. He says, what do particular actions involving food and particular foods say? To whom? In what context? With what immediate social consequences? To what structural end? And this approach, which is a common feature of many cultures, is labeled by Appadurai as gastropolitics. And he defines it as conflict or competition over specific cultural or economic resources as it emerges in social transactions around food. There is an investment in the procurement, preparation, and return of food in Shankar's life. You can see Shankar, the poor farmer, is deeply invested in the amount of food he's borrowed, the amount of food he has to return, what is to be made for the holy man, etc. Right? If, as Appadurai has suggested in another context, in South Asia, foods are regarded as an important media of contact between human beings. In a society that rests on the regulation of such contact, food is the focus of much moral and taxonomic thought. Think about it in your daily lives, right? Who is offered food in your household? People who are welcome to your household are offered food. People who are unwelcome are maybe at best offered a glass of water, right? People of a certain class are offered certain kinds of food. People of another class are offered other kinds of food in other manners which perhaps may or may not be as respectful, right? Unsurprisingly then, using this whole idea of gastropolitics then, the jowar or sorghum flour commonly used to prepare rotis in Shankar's house, we can analyze it and we can say this is not worthy of the holy man according to Shankar and according to all rules of Indian hospitality. You don't offer a holy man roti made out of jowar because you want to be respectful. You offer him food which is of a slightly elevated status, as befits the man's elevated status. Right? Wheat flour is described in the narrative as the food of the gods, and Shankar's inability to afford it indicates his penury. Such penury is accompanied by a somewhat naive moral consciousness. As already mentioned, once Shankar takes the loan of wheat, he ensures that he repays what he borrowed in the dakshina collected by the priest twice a year. Thus, he is shocked and dismayed when the priest confronts him after 6 years, asking for a return of the 5.5 seers of wheat he had borrowed. There have been various interpretations of this, that this is the moral economy of the peasant consciousness, right? The peasants are very moral, and so they, a typical peasant like Shankar would want to return what he has borrowed. And, one particular interpretation of Premchand says, the spiritual ingredients of this moral economy are social codes of conduct associated with custom and tradition. Now, what is missing from this account is, you can talk about custom and tradition and morality, but really what is missing from this account is the role of religion. The story and its subsequent dramatizations clearly point to religious strictures upholding the exploitative economic structures of agrarian life. Shankar is not unaware of this structure. He is aware of the role of religion. He is not some stupid, naive person who believes that, oh, I should really repay what I have borrowed, never mind the exploitation involved. He's quite smart. He knows that religion is being used to exploit him here. And he tells the priest, I will return what I owe you, but remember you will have to answer to a higher authority. And the priest replies, you may fear a higher authority, but why should I be afraid? Everyone there is related to me. Right? So the priest is quite content in his religious status and says, I have nothing to fear from anybody. Right? Indeed, it is this relation between the moral religious codes embodied in gastropolitics and the moral economy of dharma, understood as duties and obligations in the community, that we can situate the representation of food deprivation. Shankar is bound by codes of hospitality and reverence. In addition, he is obligated to repay the loan, even if it means mortgaging himself and his generations to come to the money-lending priest. In short, I think not just caste and class status, but also his religiosity serves as forms of hegemonic control. Now, there has been a recent burgeoning of food studies in my discipline, which is post-colonial analysis. And there is a very good book out, which is called Alimentary Tracts. Brilliant title, right? ALIMENTARY, by Parama Roy. And she says that if the exploitation of peasantry under the colonial order was marked by forms of disgust and deprivation, then one can think of post-coloniality as the promise of eating well, both in the sense of abnegating dirt and in the sense of partaking in a relationship of hospitality with the other. So, you are probably familiar with Amartya Sen's analysis of famines in colonial India, right? Famines were not, caused just by the will of the gods. They were created famines. They were, farmers were being forced to grow cash crops instead of food crops, which caused famines. They were being taxed heavily, which caused them further to sink into penury. So, once the colonial order is over, one can think, well, in post-coloniality, things will be different, right? There will be less exploitation. There will not be man-made famines. And post-coloniality can maybe be marked by the promise of eating well. If people are not eating well under the colonial order, perhaps things will change and people will begin eating well, eating sufficiently. Right? Eating well in this case is eating sufficiently, not luxuries. Right? However, the promise of eating well is not borne out by India's post-colonial history, and this becomes the basis of many plays. There are several explanations offered for food scarcity by the nation in the 1950s and 60s. And one of these is deprivation in the aftermath of the Bengal famine of 1943. There is a play by Bijon Bhattacharya called Nabana or New Crop, which is talking about this. The new government's inexperience in dealing with the public food distribution system instituted by the British and near drought conditions in the 1950s. These are all explanations given. Why did India, after independence, not manage to feed its people? There was a famine, the government was inexperienced, blah, 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 all kinds of excuses, right? This leads to the conclusion reiterated by social and economic analysis that the emphasis on food security in the planning of the post-colonial state effectively failed to curb conditions of inequality and alimentary violence, including hunger and malnutrition. Right? US wheat imports, I already referred to PL 480, which is Public Law 480. US wheat imports under PL 480 were available to Indian consumers in the 1950s and 60s. To those growing up in this period, this marks a shameful episode in Indian post-colonial history, since not only was the wheat imported different in quality, color and taste than that grown in India, it was made available under conditions that allowed the US to impose restrictive clauses on the country receiving the aid. These included removing agricultural subsidies, controls on pricing and distribution of fertilizers, and restrictions on trading with other countries. No country offers aid to another country without imposing certain conditions. You can forget that this was a gesture of altruism or charity, right? I think we can all see the connections here with the conditionalities of the 1992 International Monetary Fund Agreement. You are perhaps too young to remember, the students among the audience. I remember a time in 1992 when there was a balance of payments crisis. Right? My mother came home and said, probably the university does not have enough money to pay our salaries at the end of the month. Right? And then India had to go begging bowl in hand to the IMF and ask for a soft loan. Right? There were conditions imposed. The privatization we now see is a result of that period of crisis in the Indian economy. But I'm veering away from the topic to get back to food imports. Between 1955 and 1967, India imported 50 million tons of food grains, largely under the PL 480 program, and the bulk of these imports, and this is crucial, was directed towards urban consumers. The public distribution system at that point was not reaching everybody. It was reaching a select few, and a large section of those imports was geared towards urban consumers. This situation forms the backdrop of Indian drama in the 1960s and 70s. Much of Indian drama in the 1960s and 70s takes a form of political allegory. It does not refer directly to food as a theme or as a symbol, right? And I can explain this later in the Q&A if you want some examples. However, from the late 1970s, playwrights start foregrounding food rights. And one example is Manoj Mitra's 1977 Bengali play, which is translated into English as Bancharam's Orchard. And in this play, a wily gardener, a very clever gardener, outwits the upper caste landowners by outliving them, retaining control of a fruit orchard he has cultivated for decades and passing it on to his grandson. Quite unlike the destitute Shankar, who debt bonds himself and his son in Premchand's narrative. Plays celebrating the food self-sufficiency of the lower castes and classes in India during this period reflect the Indian government's policy of wishful outcomes, I think, arising out of investment in agriculture, including hybrid varieties of wheat tried and tested in Mexico in the 1960s. Now, this celebratory narrative of what came to be known as the Green Revolution in India begins with these innovative agricultural practices, hybrid varieties of wheat, chemical fertilizers, etc., and proceeds to declare that they paved the way to food self-sufficiency. However, as commentators have observed, the Indian government's agreement to adopt the Green Revolution package was one of the conditions of the wheat supplies promised by President Lyndon Johnson in 1966, when the country was experiencing severe drought. This is Vanna Shiva's opinion. Following the adaptation of high-yielding varieties of wheat and almost complete monocrop agricultural practices, you know what monocrop agricultural practices do. They destroy the fertility of the land itself, right? India achieved self-sustainability in food production by the 1970s. Right? Combined with the benefits of increased agricultural production and continued distribution of it through fair price shops, and we all know how fair or unfair they are. At first mainly in urban but later in rural areas, most governments from the 1970s and 80s found it easy to appease the masses through promises of subsidized food items such as wheat, lentils, rice, cooking oil, sugar, etc., tea, etc. And the distribution of these items is the main message of Janam's 1980 play, The Powerful Cannot Be Blamed, Samarth Koi Nahi Dosh Ko Sai. Next slide. Thank you. This is from Janam's website, a cool website with all the text of all the plays that they have performed, almost all the plays. If you read Hindi, you would find this really useful. Some have also been translated into English. Very valuable resource for those who are interested in street theatre, drama, or even literature in general. The group formed in the 1970s used an agitprop or agitation propaganda mode of theatre to discuss issues affecting people in their daily lives, some of which I've already mentioned, such as corruption, rising prices, police brutality, violence against women, etc. These were performed for the masses as street theatre in very innovative forms. The form of this play, and I have some photographs from it, which I'll explain. I'll go through them a little later. The form of this play is in the folk tradition of Madari Jamura, I'm sure you all know that this is a mode of performance well suited to street theatre, where a master of ceremonies or a madari introduces the play and offers most of the commentary, whereas the sidekick or the jamura echoes and reiterates his comments and invites audience participation. In fact, the madari wears a costume made of a sack labeled wheat, rice and salt. Next slide. Next slide. You can see he's wearing a sack. It says ghee, tel, namak and so on. Right? He wears a costume made of a sack labeled wheat, rice, salt. In front, at the back it says butter, oil, groceries, etc. Right? And he wears, he enters a circle of actors surrounding him. There's a circle of actors surrounding him. This is Janam's preferred mode of street theatre performances. Right? And he wears also a long black robe. Right? As he enters the circle of actors surrounding him, he throws a sack towards an actor who immediately puts it on. In the previous slide, you saw somebody was lying on the ground with a sack covering his face. Right? And pushes another actor who tumbles in front of him and is identified as the jamura. And he asks the jamura, is it okay if the play begins? And the jamura says, sir, the play can begin, but it seems as if those watching the play have not eaten any roti, since they are less than enthusiastic about the performance. He says, लगता है ये लोग घर से रोटी खा के नहीं आए, तभी ये बिल्कुल ध्यान नहीं दे रहे हैं performance पे. You know, so having introduced the issue of food consumption or roti through costume and dialogue, the play uses the exchange between the madari and jamura to introduce the public distribution system epitomized in the ubiquitous ration card, which serves as the primary means of identification and food allocation in India. This has changed, as you know. There's another card, a pink card called the BPL card, right? You have to produce the below poverty line card in order to be eligible to receive rations. If you don't have the BPL card, then you can only get kerosene. You can't get the food items, right? So there are two cards now, not just one. One is the BPL card and one is the ration card. The dramatic action in the play derives from the stratagems employed by the madari and jamura to obtain basic food items. Citing malpractices in distribution, the two point to the long lines of people waiting to buy essential food at controlled prices. To assist the people in obtaining these, the madari sends the jamura to the merchant, right? And the merchant, as usual, says, "Oh, things are out of stock. There is no supply from the government, and so on." And this is part of the strategy to escalate the prices, right? If there is shortage, then people will start clamoring for more, and then the trader can do pretty much what he wants by escalating the prices. Sneaking into the storehouse, the jamura grabs a bag of grain and brings it to the madari. The bag of grain narrates the story, and you know how funny this can get, right? A bag of grain is lying on the ground and suddenly it comes to life and starts narrating its story and says, I was born in the fields, harvested by the farmer, sold in the market and purchased by the merchants who increased my price, right? The bag of grain is personified as a child of labor, and it pledges that it will bring prosperity to those who work to produce it. And the madari, he promises to distribute the grain and other essential commodities to the public in the same spirit of generosity that Shankar in Premchand's story distributed food to his fellow villagers. The conflict arises when the merchants press the police into service to literally snatch back food from people's mouths and announces that no wheat, rice, cooking oil or sugar or salt is available at his fair or unfair price shop. Right? And the play concludes with the madari telling the jamura as well as the public to rise against corruption and to say that this is the reality of India over the past 40 years. Right? And that if the people know of this reality of corrupt ministers, merchants, politicians, police, etc., then the public must do something. The public must not only do something but take a decision right now about something which needs to be done. Right? This is what I meant when I said this is agit-prop theatre. It is exhorting the people to think, very Brechtian, as you know, exhorting the people to think and to take action, and say saying if you don't do something, then you are as bad as the rest of them. So this is a kind of a shaming which the play attempts. The play is trying to shame the audience, and it is telling people to vote out the corrupt politicians who work hand in glove with the merchants to rob people of daily necessities such as food. Now, Janan's play was performed in the 1980s, right? And it was performed quite frequently in the 1980s when the country was still following a limping model of development that emphasized social benefits to the Aam Aadmi or ordinary man. Aam Aadmi is the sort of catch-all phrase for any scheme which is introduced. Right? In the 30-odd years since its conceptualization, this play has been performed many times, though not very much in the past decade, prompting the question, what has changed to make literary and dramatic representations of food rather less relevant in contemporary India? Why is it that people who are working in drama and theatre are not talking so much about food anymore? And I may be wrong about this, but if I am, I'll be very happy to be corrected. If dramatists are talking about food, I want to know about it. All my research shows that this is not really the case right now. Certainly there is propaganda about less hunger and starvation than before as India moves from a developing to a developed nation. Although as Harsh Mandar's account indicates, food deprivation is the reality for more people in the country than the state is willing to admit. Next slide. This is the book I was talking about. Some dramatists are still talking about food. If you look at Bama, if you look at Bama writing in Tamil, if you look at Om Prakash Valmiki writing in Hindi, Dalit writers such as Arjun Dangle in Marathi, some dramatists are some authors, not necessarily dramatists, are still talking about issues of food in relation to caste and religion. But plays like Usha Ganguly's adaptation of Mahashweta Devi's story Rudali are the exception rather than the norm. This play was performed in 1992, and food literally emerges as a character in the play. Right? Ganguly's play is about, there's a movie by it, by the way, starring Dimple Kapari of all the people, in a very good performance. It's a pretty good performance, one of her best, I think. Right? Ganguly's play Rudali stages the effort of destitute women in procuring wheat, grinding it into flour and baking it into bread, roti, to eke out a meager living before they find other financially viable options. And what are these other financially viable options? Ritualistic mourning, Rudali, to weep and wail at people's funerals, they get money, or prostitution. These are more financially viable options than grinding wheat to make flour. Writing at the turn of the 20th century, novelist and social activist Arundhati Roy makes connections between the increased self-sufficiency of food in the country, the problems of making it available to the masses, and the inequities of neoliberal globalization. We are all familiar with Arundhati Roy's rather shrill rhetoric, right? But she does make sense. And I'm reading out a statement where she says, today India produces more milk, more sugar, more food grain than ever before. This year, that is 2001 when she wrote this, government warehouses are overflowing with 42 million tons of food grain. That's almost a quarter of the total annual food grain produce. Farmers with too much grain on their hand were driven to despair. In regions that wielded enough political clout, the government went on a buying spree, purchasing more grain than it could possibly store or use. While the grain rots in government warehouses, 350 million Indian citizens live below the poverty line and do not have the means to eat a square meal a day. And yet in March 2000, just before President Clinton's visit to India, the Indian government lifted import restrictions on 1,400 commodities which are now available at competitive prices all around the country, such as milk, grain, sugar, cotton, tea, coffee, and palm oil. This despite the fact that there was a glut of these products in the market. People in India were producing more of these products than could actually be consumed by by the population. While this comment makes clear that there is enough food produced within the nation for everybody, it also indicates that dietary disparities have exacerbated in the recent past. Any pride that the nation can take in producing a surplus of food is undone in Roy's mentioned critique of the Indian government's relaxation of import and price restrictions. In a classic account of food scarcity leading to famines, Amartya Sen describes the problem in terms of entitlements and acquirement. Right? With the import of and decentralization of prices of essential commodities, there are clear disparities between the entitlement, acquirement, and nature of food distributed to and consumed by people in the country. Wheat is a case in point, since it is available for purchase at subsidized rates to those below the poverty line. Those earning more than the stipulated income or not fulfilling other BPL markers and hence not categorized as poor are required to buy essential food items in the open market and not at discounted rates through the government-controlled shops. This is also the premise of the Food Security Bill. With the import of wheat being allowed, local flour brands such as Shakti Bhog Atta, etc., there are many brands you'll find in the market, open market, compete on the same playing field as imported Pillsbury Chakki Fresh Atta. Next slide, please. This is from the General Mills India website. It's quite hilarious if you read the descriptions. There are variants, which I didn't include here, but they have, for the more health conscious, they have Pillsbury 7-grain flour and Pillsbury golden wheat flour. The website proudly declares Pillsbury Chakki Fresh Atta was introduced in 1998 as a high-quality, nutritious alternative to what, I don't know, to the age-old tradition of purchasing grain and having it ground at the local chakki or flour mill. And it says that Pillsbury has been recognized as a super brand in the branded atta category and is one of the leading products with leading players with products distributed in more than 500 towns and 100,000 outlets. And the concept of brand recognition, this whole idea of food and branding, it kind of leads into the other products sold by the companies. It is relevant to the atta, which they are trying to sell to the people as a healthier, more nutritious alternative. But other products they have are pre-packaged products, bread and healthy snacks and stuff like that, right? And this is a very important concept because it connects to the idea of what is called culinary capital. And this is again not my idea, but an idea put forward by Peter Naccarato and Catherine Lebesco. And they say culinary capital is a concept which we can use to understand how and why certain foods and food-related practices connote and by extension confer status and power on those who know about and enjoy them. Right? Jayati referred to the purchasing power of the population. It says, if you put more purchasing power in people's hands, they are free to buy whatever they want, including Maggi noodles. Right? And so at some point then, culinary capital can be linked to economic capital, right? And class-based hierarchies, but may also extend beyond these traditional categories of analysis in food studies. This resonates with Ashish Nandi's claim that in India, a new self-awareness is introducing new subcultures of food, status games among culinary traditions, and a new political economy of public and private dining. Right? For instance, the consumption of Pillsbury atta connects urban households to the circuits of global capital, mainly by international brand recognition. Right? However, the brand underplays the different modes of consumption. Right? Ready-to-bake products for the first world consumer versus the more labor-intensive product atta, which is baked into rotis by the middle-class Indian consumer. For the more time-conscious and, of course, the better-earning Indian consumer, Pillsbury has a selection of ready-to-make products such as cake mixes and other pre-made foods. And this reiterates Naccarato and Lebesco's claim that culinary capital plays a role in separating and stratifying countries based on the extent to which they aspire to particular favored food ways. It's aspirational consumption. Sometimes apart from the actual food practices in which they engage. In contrast to the subsistence consumption depicted in Premchand's story and its dramatizations, and the discrepancy between real and imagined fair-priced, equitable consumption in Janam's play, aspirational consumption is the trend in post-colonial foodways in India. Hence, perhaps, the structural logic of urbanization and urban food preferences prevents some contemporary Indian dramatists from exploring stable food production and consumption as a theme in their recent work. I'm nearing towards my conclusion, and I want to say that the cultural history of shame and pride written by the dramatic representations I have discussed here continues with different connotations in the era of globalization. There were always some who made their own atta out of wheat, others who bought the milled atta, and others, like many of us here, who can afford to pay people to cook their meals. Right? While these disparities continue, there has been some mitigation in the costs of securing food through schemes like the Targeted Public Distribution System, the Antodaya Anna Yojana, and most recently the Food Security Bill. Next slide. Which, as Jayati Ghosh pointed out, will cost the state only 0.5% of the GDP extra, 0.5% extra of the GDP, as opposed to tax breaks for corporate entities amounting to over 5% of the GDP. I am no economist, but the logic of this bill makes sense to me. To provide adequate calorie intake at an affordable cost to those who need it the most. Harsh Manda points out that the humiliation and uncertainty of national food insecurity has receded due to massive increases of food production from the 1970s onwards. But that in this scenario, the laggards have been coarse cereals and pulses, as both agricultural policies and the PDS contribute to what some believe to be irreversible changes in tastes and production, away from coarse grain to rice and wheat, to the disadvantage of the poorest communities from the perspective of both price and nutrition. The Food Security Bill regulates the price of rice at 3 rupees, you can see that here, wheat at 2 rupees, and coarse grains at 1 rupee per kilogram to provide for food and nutritional security by ensuring access to adequate quantity of quality food at affordable prices to people to live a life with dignity. Sadly, the drama associated with wheat and other food grains has shifted away from socially conscious representations on television, such as Premchand's narrative, and on the streets, as in Janam's play, to shrill outcries against food subsidies, as well as media blitzes where whole wheat and multigrain snacks are advertised as signaling a shift away from the humble roti to healthy sandwich bread, crackers, etc., to a nation consuming branded foods with pride. Thank you.
Wonderfully informative lecture. It really made us sit up and think about various things which relate food and the way it's represented fictionally, along with some harsh realities in pre-independence and post-independent India. And also ponder on new terms like gastropolitics and culinary capital. But I must confess that I've heard them for the first time, but I think they are very graphic, and they really make you sit up and think about these ideas. A humble observation, perhaps in a discussion like this, you could include Ashwini Shanket or The Distant Thunder. This was a film, one of the later films of Satyajit Ray. It took up the famine of 1943, which, especially in the cities, which was because most of the food grain was being diverted to the war. I would now throw the paper open to the House for discussion.
This is especially with respect to Americanization of food in India. I want to ask a specific question. Uh, why, why is it that corporations and their investment when it comes to TV industry plays such a big role in directing us towards a particular stream of food? Say for example, 40 years back or say 50 years back, we were pretty much okay with sarson ka tel. Then came, no, it's bad for heart and all those kind of things, refined oil. Then came rice bran oil. Then came all other types of oil, and now Sanjeev Kapoor is, there's a whole food channel जिसमें वो 550 रुपए वाले तेल में खाना ही बनाता रहता है. What do you have to say about this particular kind of tea? Because this is something that is very predominant when it comes to TV industry, and TV industry plays a very important role because it reaches out to almost every person when it comes to India.
Well, thank you for that question. Can you hear me? Well, of course, TV, broad reach across the country, right? In some ways, both international brands as well as the media are catering to consumers, consumers of food as well as consuming audiences who are consuming the programs Sanjeev Kapoor and others are making. So I don't know that I can answer your question, but what I can say is that markets keep changing, and particularly with more open channels of communication, people are more exposed to what folks are eating in other parts of the world, right? And so one of the things I mentioned was aspirational consumption, right? So Sanjeev Kapoor frying things in oil which is 500 rupees a kg is it is not a mode of cooking which everybody is likely to follow or which everybody can practice in reality, right? So in some ways, this is a projection of what people are doing in other parts of the world, may or may not be doing in other parts of the world, what are the consumers' habits as far as food is concerned in various different locations, right? So people can see and enjoy these representations. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll change their food habits. For one, they may not be able to afford the change, right? And even if they can, they may not agree with the nutritional benefits which are being branded about, right? So I think take it for what it is, a representation influenced by processes of globalization, right? Not necessarily the way in which people actually eat or the way people would actually want to eat. Some may and some may not. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Also, they might be the sponsor.
Yeah.
They might be the sponsor.
Purvi brings up a very important point. Part of the program may have been paid for by the olive oil brand which Sanjeev Kapoor is promoting, right? If you look at magazines, if you look at these commercial magazines, they have a very clever strategy. They'll have a one-page advertisement of, let's say, Lakme products on one page, but 5 pages later they may have a kind of an article which describes. It's actually pretty shameful to call it an article. It's more advertising than anything else. An article by somebody giving makeup tips, and in that they'll say, well, Lakme products are the best for these style aspirations, right? So clearly Lakme has a presence in the magazine in the form of an advertisement, but it also has a presence in the so-called article, right? In much the same way as Purvi just pointed out, the oil brand might be sponsoring part of Sanjeev Kapoor's program, right? But again, I reiterate, this is a representation, of the way people might be eating in some parts of the world and in India, but might not be either, right? It's fun to watch cooking shows, isn't it? I watch them to relax, right? I may not cook everything which is being shown there, or even use half of the ingredients which are being shown there, but it's just pure entertainment, right?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. This is not a question particularly, but it's an observation. I thought while you were mentioning the relationship between Green Revolution and and the representation of production, of food production and sufficiency for our country, I thought that relationship needed to be problematized a little further. Green Revolution was not a monolithic phenomenon to begin with. It was a very selective, geographically and historically, it was a very selective process. And it did not necessarily result also in a particular kind of equation between sufficiency and dependence that you talk about through your exposure of PL 480 and the Indian States Agency. Secondly, I would also like to, I was wondering about this, since you talk a lot about the kind of associations that emerge in literature, in not only Premchand's literature but also in Janam's street theatre. How was the discourse of science being mobilized to justify or legitimize certain representations of both starvation, hunger, and also sufficiency and fulfillment, satiation? I was just wondering about these two very different aspects aspects that I was thinking about through your paper. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. In response to the first observation, I completely agree with you when you say that Green Revolution is it has to be looked at with varying perspectives. And it is not my opinion that the Green Revolution led to food self-sufficiency in that completely unproblematized manner that was touted by some. Right? What I was trying to say was that this was the way the Green Revolution was presented to the people. Right? And this way of representation has been questioned very roundly and soundly. It has been questioned. There are several documentaries you can watch. One is called Seeds of Plenty, Seeds of Sorrow. Wonderful documentary which talks about actually the ravages of the Green Revolution, right? On the soil, on the people who had invested in those Green Revolution modes of agriculture, right? So certainly we cannot use the Green Revolution as the marker that it was touted by the government and by certain commentators, right? I agree with you on that score completely. The second question, it's a little more difficult for me to answer. I can say that in terms of scientific discourse, the one which has been mobilized the most is dietary discourse. Particularly when it comes to calorie intake, when it comes to body mass index, when it comes to what kinds of food are essential for a healthy, happy life, and those descriptions vary. Some people, some scientists, based on certain markers in the West, have said a certain number of calories are essential for a person to be healthy. Some Indian scientists have refuted that and said, well, this is not a correct estimate, right? It varies between 1,500 and 2,000 calories, right? That is a big source of disagreement, right? And calorie needs can be fulfilled in various ways. People can eat wheat and rice and other high calorie foods, but that doesn't mean that that's a nutritious diet, does it? For it to be a nutritious diet, you need other things with it, right? One of the things which has happened is that while India has been surging ahead in the production of these essential food grains, as they are touted, even the Food Security Bill refers to those, right? What about other stuff, which is equally necessary for a nutritious diet, particularly for people who are engaged in hard physical manual labor, right? So this is where scientific, if you want to call them that, or dietary differences come into opinions on what constitutes a nutritious diet, what leads to a healthy population. This is where debates come into being. I don't know what other aspects of science you had in mind. Perhaps when it comes to agricultural sciences, is that what you had in mind?
Also, geography, just geology and geography. There was so much discourse also about what kind of agrarian practices were right,
Right.
and
right.
what kind of combination of weather, soil, and practices, human practices, could lead to a sufficient land production.
Right.
And I was wondering, to also address to some extent what you've been saying, I think it's also a good point to start deconstructing this whole notion of a particular kind of combination, a particular set of food products that are enabling and healthy and nutritious. And since you've been talking about hard physical labor, I think it's also a good point to start rethinking of what we consider as nutritious, and where are these concepts coming to us? Where are these concepts coming to us from? And what is the location and historicity of these concepts? And I was just wondering, what are the literary and theatrical practices that talk or speak to such concepts? Are you aware or are you familiar with any of these street theater practices or plays particularly? I'm not sure.
I don't know of any play offhand that I can think of which goes into such nuances, as it were. Certainly street theater cannot. As you know, it's the format will not allow it to go into these kinds of details. Right? It is if it's a 10-minute performance, it has to get the message across in as simple and direct a manner as possible. Perhaps a longer production might go into these various intricacies of food production, as well as the nutritional content of food, etc. I mentioned Rudali before. There's a lot of talk about food in that. Both in terms of food as fulfilling bodily wants, but also in terms of appetites, as it were. Appetite for food, appetite for sex. So there are representations which are problematizing this, but not necessarily dealing with the scientific discourse around food that you are referring to, in the way that you are referring to, right? Then you look at Bama, Karuku, right? And then see how also Sangati in some ways, Sangati which really talks about the subtext is always hunger, deprivation, hunger. Or Om Prakash Valmiki, why go far? Jutan, the title itself, Jutan. Low caste people who are literally eating the leftovers or the remains, of more nutritious meals, as it were, right? So hard to say about the scientific discourse being represented in literature. I don't know. Offhand, I can't say. Perhaps some of you who are more familiar with 20th and 21st century literature can enlighten me on that. But thank you for that question. It's food for thought, to use a bad pun.
Thank you for your talk. I just want to have a couple of observations. One, I was wondering, when we're talking of Pillsbury versus, say, the Shakti Bhog atta, what about something like rice? And when you talk about the basmati rice and the patent about the basmati rice. So again, something which we take for granted or as staple, how it is being seen in a post-globalized world. The second connects to a lot of discussion that we've been having till now. When, medical reasons, dietary reasons, reasons given by nutritionists, how they change our thoughts about food. Something like which, over here in the story, that the play that you have referred to, there's a clear hierarchy between the jawar and the wheat. Whereas now you will also keep going back to the more humble jawar and bajra. or to, the multigrain atta or the multigrain bread. So, the traditional notions of how one has looked at various grains is also constantly being redefined by the way the nutritionist will tell you. So one is, the nutritional value. Two, as has been already referred to, the various food shows. So you are being how, in a localized world, you're being exposed to these cuisines then to a different geographical, cultural region. And one thing which we haven't referred to and now probably doesn't come across in theatre, but certainly probably in contemporary short stories, food and eating out. So the cultures which are being redefined through that. Because when we have already referred to it, because we are all of us located from an urban scenario, and when you said that not all of us may be enjoying the shows, may not be cooking at home, and we have that, but how this entire concept of eating out is, redefining the way one is, looking at food as cultures of connection.
Thank you, Rachna. I'm so happy to see you here. Just to go back to your first observation about rice, another staple food grain, many parts of the world, right? Mexico, right? Mexicans eat a lot of rice. Chinese, different kinds of rice. Indians eat a lot of rice. Where I currently live in Texas, half the city is Mexican, American, or Hispanic. They don't like to use the word that word now, but Mexican American. Let's say Mexican American, right? So every second restaurant is a Mexican restaurant. And rice is the staple with every meal, right? There's a little bit of rice with every meal that is served, right? Different kinds of rice can be found in the stores. If you go to a Chinese grocery store or what they call Asian grocery store, you will find jasmine rice or other kinds of rice. In an Indian grocery store, you're more likely to find different kinds of basmati rice, right? In a standard American grocery store, Walmart kind of store, you will find variants of basmati which tastes nothing like basmati. I laughed out aloud the first time I saw it. It's called Texmati. I have never eaten Texmati rice and I don't know what it tastes like. I'm not sure. I want to find out. But here is where the idea of an Indian, I don't know that we can call basmati a brand. It is probably now become that. But certainly a certain kind of rice which is recognized as very flavorful and very delicious and very Indian is the name has been lifted and something called Texmati rice is being produced, right? And so brand recognition or name recognition, as if you want to call it that plays a role in every kind of cereal which is being produced, right? And to answer the second part of your question, sure, the nutritional benefits of the humbler food grains, jowar and bajra and all these, are recognized everywhere in the world. There's rye bread available in American grocery stores, there's rye bread available here, there's multi-grain bread available. It doesn't matter that it costs 2 times as much as a wheat loaf, right? 20 rupees for half a loaf of bread, whole wheat, and 40 rupees for multi-grain bread, right? So sure, the benefits of various kinds of food grains are being recognized, but you have to pay a price for that recognition, right? The consumer pays a price, right? Now there is another theory, and I don't know how much of a truth is there in this, but apparently, if a particular food product contains more than 5 cereals, maybe 7-grain bread or 12-grain bread or whatever is available in the market, that, according to some nutritionists, has no extra nutritional value than 5-grain bread. So basically, anything more than 5 grains in a product does not carry any extra nutritional value. Now, how much truth there is to that statement, I don't know, right? The theory is that, if you are eating 12-grain bread and thinking that you are doing your body a favor by doing that, well, think again. It's fine for you to eat 5-grain bread. It's just as well for you to eat 5-grain bread rather than 12-grain bread. Then, of course, the new fad is gluten, right? Wheat contains gluten, as you know, right? Now, gluten has been medically um, proven to have some role to play in arthritis. Right? So a lot of people are now adapting a gluten-free diet. Right? Restaurants are carrying gluten-free menus. Right? Wheat and I think rye and some other grains contain gluten, which it's that the substance which makes wheat sticky, as it were. Right? That's gluten. Right? So gluten-free diets are the latest fad. So I don't know where it's going to end and what are the nutritional benefits of a gluten-free diet versus a gluten-full diet, right? Or what are the benefits of 12-grain bread versus 5-grain bread? The more people you talk to or the more you read, the differing opinions, are likely to surface, right? Again, not an answer, but just a series of observations in response to yours.
Do we have time?
One more question now.
This is not really a question, but it's a loud thought, so it's not a question in that sense. So I'm of course for government intervention for public in that sense, but if you look at how it's been happening, look at food out to rotten godowns in Punjab, and I am very suspect with these latest big-ticket UPA reforms. And I'm not going to Anguti Roy, but I have suspicion, and I feel that the food security bill is probably another strategy to bolster lower bureaucracy. Is to make them rich, is to make the middle castes rich, and to perpetuate the caste divide, you see, because the people who are, let's say, the landless or the poorest are generally, by and large, lower caste in that sense. So that's my suspicion. So I still don't know the answers to this, but probably 5 years, 10 years later, we would have them. So.
I don't know about the real motivations behind the food security bill. Of course, the most common one, which is being advocated, is that it's a populist measure. The government is trying to appease the masses. Elections are coming up. Of course, that's a very simple and a rather simplistic explanation. So what? I mean, if a bill promises food to a certain set of people at affordable prices, I don't care if it's a populist measure, if it helps somebody win the election. There is not much to choose in any case between the two political parties, right? Here is the other thing. 5 years from now will not be the time when we'll be able to find out. The prices are fixed for 3 years, right? We'll see what government, whichever government comes in power, we'll see how it is implemented and how it is continued and whether it is even continued in the first place or not, right? So the regulation of the prices is only valid for 3 years. You read that, right? Towards the end of the food security bill, right? I don't know whether it is a ploy to strengthen the middle and upper classes at the expense of the lower classes. I can't speak to its implementation. There are, however, adequate provisions within the bill itself. I only included the first paragraph of the bill and the last paragraph of the bill. There's a 16-page document, if anybody cares to read it, right? Not very long enough that you need to spend several days reading it, but certainly not short enough to omit the details which are necessary for its implementation, right? So there are inbuilt measures, right, to prevent the kind of malpractices which have been happening in the public distribution system for so many decades, right? Mechanisms are there, right? Now we don't know whether those mechanisms will be implemented or not, right? There is a successful model of a public distribution system in Chhattisgarh, right? As outlined in Mandar's book, he and his team interviewed people in several states, primarily Odisha, Rajasthan, and Chhattisgarh, and a few other states, Andhra Pradesh as well, right? And they found problems in most states, but in Chhattisgarh they found that the public distribution system was being implemented in a fairly successful manner, not completely successful. You can't curb leakages completely. You can only minimize them, right, through regulation, right? So we don't know how it will be implemented, what kind of class and caste politics it will lead to, but I think I would prefer to begin from a position of belief rather than one of suspicion, and to see it as something good, even if it is an electoral ploy, even if it is meant to appease the masses. It doesn't matter, it is something good. If something comes out of it, I think we should be proud of that. If nothing comes out of it, we should all be ashamed of having supported this measure. But I suspect that some good will come out of it.
One last question.
Yeah, good evening. Ms. Patra, that was a very, very informative session, and got to know quite a lot about what food security stood post pre the colonial and pre-independence and what it is now. I believe just hearing out everyone post the discussion, the consumerism which has actually been inculcated, that needs to change. First of all, I think we need to define that what nutrition actually is. I mean, for instance, a nutrition for somebody who's actually driving around in AC cars and he's attending board meetings at all 5-star hotels, and the nutrition which a farmer needs, he's slogging himself throughout the day in the sun. So I think that's the first point which we should look at. If we are trying to compare what is food as it is branded in the urban landscape to what it should be, I think that is something which needs to be done, which has not yet been done. A very, very surprising element, I never read that document, Food Security Bill, before attending this session, and it's only for 3 years. Albeit for 3 years, I think again the point is very well written that we need to curb the leakages, we need to actually plug the gaps. How it needs to be done, that has to be, the problem in India primarily boils down to implementation. I think we have fantastic policies. At one hand of the spectrum, we are the third largest economy in the globe, growing at humongous rates of growth, which of course has come down now. But still, are we doing the right things at the right time with the right spirit? That is what needs to be done. And this is just my observation in terms of how we need to do it. That's most important. Just writing a 16-page document and implementing it over a period of the next 9 months till the next government comes into the picture, that's a different story. But now we need to look at in terms of implementation. That's the major thing. If we say that it's for 3 years, I don't think that 3 years is a good enough time, because I mean we can't say that 65% of India's agrarian economy, of course, gets the right amount of nutrition, which is not the case. Should it go along? Yes, of course. I think all of us who are actually giving time for this particular cause, we need to support it further. We need to take it forward, and we need to actually spell it out to the bureaucracy that this needs to be done over a long period of time, and the segment which we are looking at has to widen. I mean, I believe you must have read the book by Dr. C.K. Prahlad, Prophet at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And that is where he talks about that what India actually is, what we see right now. We are actually, scratching the surface. The amount of the number of people that we have in that particular segment, talk about 65% of India's population pertaining to agrarian economy. That is where we have to look at, and I would actually go ahead and support this cause.
Please keep your observation brief.
Yeah, so I would actually support this cause, and I think we should, like as you said, ending that we should look at the glass full rather than being the glass empty. So I think that's how we should look at this particular cause.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. One of the startling statistics is that in the early 1990s, 46% or 47% of India's children were malnourished. Right? In the sort of 20 odd years, which is the globalization decade for India, the statistic has changed. 47% in the 1990s and 46% in 2010. So, what has changed? If 1% of the population of children have managed to achieve sufficient food in the 20 odd years since liberalization, that is indeed a shameful fact, right? Shame on all the governments, I said, I mean, that during those years, they have not managed to see that at least the children's nutritional needs are taken care of, right? And we all know the big fiasco with the midday meals, right? We all know that, right? And that was a way to keep the children in schools. It has become a way to send children to their graves, literally, right? And so there are schemes, like you said, very good schemes, probably the most progressive schemes any country has instituted anywhere in the world, and that should be a matter of pride. But the implementation and the actual, benefits of the schemes reaching to the people who need it the most, that is not a matter of pride. So thanks for your comment, and I completely agree with what you said.
Well, thank you all very much, and I'm happy to see that it was a very, very interactive session. Though I must say economics stole the thunder in the literature, kind of retreated a bit, but well, never mind. Thank you all for coming and participating, and of course listening to the lecture.
Thank you, Kanika. This is really a very, very insightful lecture, and I think this will really help us think about this very, very crucial kind of topic. It's very important that we think about this very insightful lecture. Thank you very much. And Purvi, thank you very much for the chair. And we have on the next TRISM lecture is on October 8th by Richard Mahapatra, who is the editor of Down to Earth. This is a lecture on environment, and please be there. And we have this film on October 15th.